topic of this session is the Angular router. I'm going to talk about the new Angular router, obviously. My name is Nikas Praninskas. I'm a front-end developer at Wix.com at the app market team. And I've been digging into the new router for the best of the last month. We're doing in the app market a lot of interesting stuff, and this was one of the things that we're trying to experiment with. And I'm here to tell you about how it looked like, what we did, and what came out of that. So life is short. Here's what the next 45 minutes of yours is going to look like. I'm going to talk about what happened before, where we are now, sort of the prior art of routing. Then I'm going to tell you all about the new component router. And then I'm going to look at how we might migrate to it. And then see how the current state of affairs looks like. So a disclaimer. I know someone made a joke here that everything has a disclaimer. Everything right now is a work in progress, very much so. So everything might change, and this is a complete waste of your time. OK, let's look at prior art. So what is there now? What we're going to do with it? So what are routers in general? What sort of issues do they solve? One thing that's really important in modern applications is deep linking. It gives you the ability to share information, to basically copy and paste the link to someone else. It gives you the context to know where you are in the current application, and it allows you to bookmark it for later use. So in general, it's very useful. Another thing we want our applications now to do is to not break the back button. It's something that the browser gives us for free, and it's often very rude for the user to actually expect some behavior and for us to change it. And another thing that the router is supposed to give you is some sort of structure for your application, which forces you to modularize it, make it easier to understand for other people. In that way, the router is the backbone of your application. So without further ado, let's look at the current solutions. So the default Angular 1 routing solution is ng-route. Who's here using ng-route, actually? All right, so there are a few people. And it's going to become very clear why that's so. So ng-route, in essence, is very, very simple. You have one view per application, and that one view contains all of your states, views, whatever you put in there. It's basically templates, controllers. And another thing that's really interesting is resolve. It's basically the ability for you to tell that, all right, when we go to this place, we first need to get some data. That makes the controllers very, very easy to test, because you just have the data and you can inject it later on in your unit tests. And it's kind of a nice thing. Now, the problem with ng-route is that it's way too simple for most applications, and that's why so few of you are actually using it. It's very difficult to do things like modals, sidebars, deep routing, because you have to specify the entire configuration all the time. It's pretty much impossible to do parallel views in an easy manner, and basically it doesn't work for complex applications. And here comes UI router, which is sort of the de facto solution for Angular 1. Who here is using Angular UI router? Yeah, all right, that's more like it. So fundamentally, it's much more powerful, simply because it's state-based, and states are kind of awesome. The configuration looks similar. It's also got things like resolve. It's got templates, controllers, all of that cool stuff. But it also adds some new things, which makes it why people use it so much. So states fundamentally are very intuitive. They let you describe architecture. And obviously, not everything in an application has to have a URL. There are partial states which you kind of want to go through but never stay there for longer, or you don't want people to link there. And your router also lets you do easy linking, because you can just point to a state and then the link will be generated afterwards, so it's easy to refactor. Another thing that your router provides is lots of utility. So things like UI sref, which, as I mentioned, allows you to point to state directly. Another thing is UI-sref active, which allows you to sort of mark the state active, use classes to style your app. There's also things like is, go, href, and all that, which I won't get into, but they're usually very, very useful to us as application developers. Customizing UI router is possible. It's definitely possible, and it's the reason why it's another reason why it's very popular. You can do a lot of things with on-enter, on-exit, the events that it exposes. There's even a project now which builds on top of UI router. It's called UI router extras, and it adds stuff like sticky states and sort of parallel views, and it lets you do more. But this is only up to a point. And if you do something complex enough, you start to sort of fight UI router, which is not a cool thing to be in. And a while ago, we had such a complex thing in our own product. We were trying to build the app market. Now, the interesting thing about the app market is that it has a modal. And what the modal has to have deep linking. What this means, it has to have the same URL pointing to two different background states. So the modal is the same, but what's behind it differs, whether you go to it directly or from inside the application. It looks something like this. You have two different paths to the same place. One is to open the app market and click the app icon, and another is to just go directly, for example. And they both have to preserve their own history, know where they came from, and that is really, really difficult to do in UI router as it is now. Now it's possible. At that time, it was so difficult that we actually had to do a fork to get it working in a convenient fashion for us. Even now, it's still not very obvious how to do it, and you have to go to the UI router extras project to get some stuff out of there and sort of put it in. With this in mind, Angular 2 is coming. Can we do something better with a fresh start? So here I'm introducing the new Angular router, which recently actually got a name. It's going to be called the component router. You heard it here second? I don't know. All right, let's talk about what it's trying to achieve. The first and most important part of the new router goals is to be customizable, to let people do very complex, very interesting, and surprising things. Because we, as library designers, we can't always expect people, and we can't anticipate what they're going to do there. But we also want to have very great defaults in that we want to let people with no experience sort of just put it in and use it without fiddling with it too much. So we want to make it obvious and easy to use. Another thing we want to do is, this is more practical, is we want to allow multiple views that are either parallel or nested. And this is very, very useful for things like modals and other complex scenarios. We want to offer state-like reverse routing, which means we want to deep link to parts of our applications without actually specifying the URL. And we want it to be state-like. So we want to link to like collections of components, to link to sort of larger parts of our application. So another and final thing that we want to sort of look at with the new router is achieved by a thought experiment. So as I've mentioned before, the router is one of the most important parts of your application. It's sort of the backbone. So if it's designed for Angular 2, but if we can actually make it work also in Angular 1, then it could be the migration bridge between Angular 1 and Angular 2. Let's take a look at how such a migration might look like. So say we have an Angular 1 application. It's composed of Angular 1 modules. And if we're using the new component router, we can start replacing parts of the application with Angular 2. We can use Angular 2 under Angular 1 and vice versa. And then after a while, doing this piecewise replacement and upgrade, we can then achieve something like this, hopefully, which is an Angular 2 application from our old Angular 1 application. Yes? I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Yeah. So this is all theory. This is what we're trying to achieve. and I'm sure all of you sort of want to see the code already. So let's go there. This is Angular 2.x. This is how the configuration is going to look there. I hope it's visible. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with the component syntax, but it's essentially a component, an Angular 2 component. And Angular 2 is made of components. And the only real annotation on that is part of the router is the route config. And you can see that it takes a path and has a component and other properties I'm not talking about right now. In Angular 1, it's going to look very similar. It's essentially the same configuration. And this static configuration is what makes it very easy to port in the future. So you don't actually need to change anything that much. Just do a simple search and replace. Would make your application Angular 2 compatible. So let's look at the constituents of the component router. What the public interface looks like to you as a developer. It consists of 4 main concepts, and I'm going to go over each of them in turn. So let's look at components. In Angular 2, a component is part of the essence of the framework, so it's very easy to define. If anyone's got an Angular 2, some Angular 2 knowledge, they know it already. And I'm not going to get into it right now that much. In Angular 1, a component is defined as a template, controller, and optionally a router. So let's look at templates first. In ng2, it's specified in the view annotation. It's very usual. In Angular 1, the components, since there isn't a default solution for this, they adopted a component convention, which means that it's trying to taking the string name of your component and turning it into a path. And the path is by default under components and then your component HTML. But you can also customize that if you wish. So for anyone who's actually using right now any sort of routing, they don't have to fear that they'll have to move every file around, because you can just make whatever you wish there. Controllers are in Angular 2 very, very similar. They're simple. They're just a class. It's a controller, not really, but acts like one. In Angular 1, it's a controller. And the convention is to add a controller name by default and then try to resolve it by that. But you can also customize it. So that's really nice for people with existing applications. Let's talk about the router part of a component. So each component can optionally have a child router, which would then take over the routing in sub-URLs, which means any URLs subsequent to the actual component. And this is very powerful, because say you have a very cool users management component, you can then take it, you can package it up, all the states with deep linking, and then you can publish it, and then someone else can use it, mount it up, and they will have deep linking, and they won't have to worry about what's going on inside of your component. So this is very, very, very useful. The router configuration is specified by another annotation in Angular 2. And you can see here some of the properties that it allows you to do currently. And you can see even the last configuration is the components, which allows you to use many, many, many components in one place and refer to that as one thing. In Angular 1, there's a few ways to actually specify the route configuration. One is to put a static property route config on top of your function. And another is to inject the router. They're both very useful, and they come into different places. And let's talk about outlets. So outlets are fundamentally the same as UI view, which means that it's just a place where you put components into. And you can specify them the same way as you do UI view. You can specify the name, or you can just leave it out and it'll be default. Not that much more to talk about them. Let's go instructions. Instructions is the context for a transition from one application part to another, from one application state to another. And it holds the outlets, the path, the parameters. But it's best explained by looking at the final and most important part of the new component router, the pipeline. And the pipeline, for those who've worked with it, it's essentially middleware. And what it does is it takes an instruction and then it transforms it with some side effects. So let's look at an example of the pipeline in Angular 1, because it's the best way to understand it. Here's the pipeline. The details aren't that important. The steps I will go over. But let's say we ask the router to go somewhere. So in this example, we asked the router to go to users/123. So some sort of user with the ID 123. And what happens then? So the first thing that happens is that the router tries to recognize the URL. It tries to recognize it, and if it does, it generates an instruction. And as you can see, this is what the instruction would look like. It has the matched URL, which is where it's trying to go to, the component that actually matched it, the router that did it, and then some sort of recursive structure of other instructions. What it does then is it puts the instruction to the pipeline, and the pipeline is a standardized thing. And it puts it, and it goes through each of the steps in turn. So the first step is to actually set up the routers. So go recursively over the children of the instruction and just add that to the routing, to the data structure. Then it adds locals such as the router, route params, which are useful for it being injected into the controllers. Then it tries to go over all the old outlets and see if they can be deactivated. And this is the step that would be responsible for example, making sure that when you navigate out of an edit component, it would say, oh, you have unsaved changes. Do you want to go? So you could have put it into this hook and then have that run on every transition out of it. Another step is to visit over the new outlets that are going to be activated and see if they can be activated. So here you could do something similar to resolve, see if you have all the available data, match the preconditions, and if only then you can allow the actual controllers to be instantiated inside of it. The next step, we load the templates. This is specific to Angular 1. But essentially what it does is does a template request and just puts it into the instruction. And the final step of this pipeline is to go over all the outlets that it saved in the process and recursively activate them, which means instantiate the templates, compile them, put the controllers there, essentially wire everything up, and then do one final thing, is we update the location, and we're done. We went from one application state to another via the pipeline. So another good thing, and possibly the most important thing about the pipeline, is that it is very customizable, and you can choose what you put there. So you can see the default here, but let's add a resolve step. And anyone else who's worked with either ng-route or UI router will be familiar with this. So a resolve step is fundamentally a service, and we'll go through some steps to actually create it. It's visible, okay. So what we first do is we create a new service, or a factory in this case, with the name of the step that we want to have. Then in our implementation, we would go over all of the instructions, of the sub-instructions, and for each instruction that we go through, we would queue the resolution configuration, so we would get it from the instruction of some sort. This is not finalized yet, and it will be available to the instruction, but it's a bit of a dark spot now. I've implemented this, but it's complicated, so I won't get into it, of how to actually get the configuration from the instruction. Then the next step would be to queue the resolution, so just call it with the injector, and when it's done, we can just add it to the locals, and it will be available to the controllers that want to use these resolves. So one final thing, when we have this, we have to insert it into the pipeline. And the pipeline is has a provider. So you just, this code is, the details aren't important. What it does is essentially take the name of the new step that you have, the new service, and plug it into the pipeline config provider steps. And the end result is that we have a resolve step in our pipeline. And this means that it's part of the pipeline. It's getting called on every transition. And it allows you to control some parts of your application. The implications of this are that we have a standardized point of extension. We can make the pipeline be ours, be truly ours, make it suit our application. And another interesting part is that we can take and publish parts of our pipeline to other people. So you could for example, you could imagine people giving you their own pipeline stuff that's really useful as a Bower component. And this is kind of nice. Some things don't quite fit into the nice picture that I've painted so far. So the ability to do sticky components is very, very useful if you want to do something like modals. So this is how it currently works. So you could, for example, when you open a modal, you could just not change your other parts of your application, and it will stay there. And this is under consideration and desirable. I think it's sort of a artifact of the implementation right now, but I'm fairly sure it's going to make it in the end into the final version. You can add new routes at runtime, which means that you can load components dynamically, and it's very, very useful. This is interesting, and I'm sure it's going to make it. And one final thing, which is kind of crazy, is that you can do recursive components, and I'm not really sure why that would be useful, but I mean it's possible, so why not? Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how you might go to using this router. So we know something about when we already have the new component router with regards to Angular 2. Since it's designed for Angular 2 and the migration scenario told here is going to be pretty much streamlined for you. You don't have to worry about too many things. But what about when we're actually using something else, something like UI router, something like ng-route? How do we go to the component router to prepare for the future? So ng-route is very simple, and I won't expand on it. It's probably going to be a few easy transitional steps you can take. But the interesting part is what happens to UI router. And there are definitely going to be steps outlined that you can take to migrate one-to-one mapping from your current application using UI router to something that uses the component router. But right now, those aren't clear. What we can do is, however, see how that might be achieved in the future. So multi-components are basically states in the way that it allows you to specify two components, for example, that will be activated at the same time, and you can refer to them as a category in this example. You can see the configuration is very similar, and that will make it easier to move. Another thing is that the directives that will be available are also sort of map one-to-one to each other. So you can have the router link and router params be equivalent of UI sref. What about the stuff that's missing from the component router that's in UI router? Well, the answer is the pipeline. And you saw how easy it is to add something like a resolve. We can also fake state change events. So we can add a new pipeline step that just sends the state change start and other events you want. And maybe I can imagine someone writing an actual adapter that you just plug into your pipeline, and from then on you use the new component router instead of the UI router, which is kind of cool. So what can we do to prepare if you intend to actually do this? So we can start using similar conventions. One of the convention that is very convenient to use in this aspect is the component-like architecture. So if anyone's familiar with the modular architecture for large-scale Angular applications, the one where you actually group everything by modules instead of the types of files that you have, that's something you can use, and it will make it easier to move. Another thing we can do is we can actually test our UI router configuration. It is testable. It's not very easy, but I've written a blog post about it. If anyone wants to check it out, it's there. What this allows us to do is to write some tests now and then verify once component router is stable, ready, and good to go. We can then verify that our migration went successfully. This is very nice. And the component router should be even easier to test. So for anyone who's a unit testing geek, they will be happy about this. All right, so with all that said, let's look at what the current state of affairs looks like in the repository. So this is the documentation right now. So as you can see, it's in an early stage. So you say, all right, I'll be brave, I'll read the source. You go to the Angular router repository. Turns out it's moved to another place. So it's now in the main Angular repository, Angular 2 repository. But then you find out it's only there for a while, and it's going to move again. So to summarize, the code base is right now a bit of a mess. The 1.x branch hasn't really worked for over a month. And I would know, I've tried to actually use it. The original topic of this talk was the new router in practice. Clearly that did not work out. So everything right now is in the Angular 2 repository until they get the build stable. Apparently they're using some sort of experimentation process right now to try out different tools. And they're still working out some of the core issues, like reverse routing, other stuff. So you might be asking yourself, when is this going to finally destroy me? So it was originally slated for 1.4, but not anymore. This is the last week's meeting notes. I'm anxiously awaiting this week's. My guess it's probably going to go somewhere June or July. But again, it's a guess. So something like 1.45 is very reasonable. To do a summary of the entire thing, the new router, the new component router, has been designed from the ground up. It's been designed with new ideas that will help us in the future. It's still being designed, which is interesting. It's been designed with lessons we have learned so far, which is nice. This is specifically the multiple views, the ability to actually dynamically load our routes. But the problem with it, it's not yet ready, and right now, not even remotely ready, although there might have been a commit while I was talking that fixed it. That's how fast it's moving. And if I were you, I would probably delay experimenting with it for a month or two. And then, middle July, it's probably going to be good enough to actually start migrating, if you wish. So, thank you, and I'm waiting for questions. All right, so the question is, Rob Eisenberg, the author of Aurelia, actually initially was the one responsible for writing this. Now it's Brian Ford. And the question was, have I toyed with the Aurelia router and is it better? So the Aurelia router has an advantage in that it actually works right now. The fundamentals are very similar, and if you go there, they also have the pipeline, they also have everything. But the challenges sort of arise from the way Angular works. So you can see what they're trying to achieve, but it's still not quite possible with the current implementation of the Angular thing. It fundamentally is the same. They're trying to go for the same goals. The implementation is, of course, completely different. Thanks. Yep. All right, so the question is it a good idea do I think it's a good idea to move a project piece by piece, as I've outlined before? I think it's possibly the only thing, if you really want to move something, it's possibly the only thing you can do reasonably if it's a large enough project. If it's small, then you can probably do it all at once. It's good that they allow you to do this. I'm not sure how interesting, how performant it will be to load both Angular versions at the same time, which is what that proposed scenario would do. So I would wait, see where it goes. It's technically possible at this stage, but interesting. It has to be experimented with. It's a bit too early for that. Thank you. Yeah. So the question is, how does Google index all the links, right? So Google now, praise Jesus, supports JavaScript. We're experimenting with it right now. So it does actually evaluate the JavaScript on there, and it does generate the hrefs, and then it can crawl them. From what I've read, it's actually surprisingly robust, and it works. It works even for stuff you insert afterwards with plain JavaScript. So before, the solution was to use something like prerender.io, which would just sort of take your Angular application and run it through static rendering. I think in the future we're just going to forget about it and let Google take care of it. I mean, it's their framework. They sort it out. Thank you.